3. When Jesus turned water into wine at a wedding in Cana of Galilee, we learned that his ministry was about transformation. We looked at that about a month ago. And ever since then, we've been looking at what the process of transformation and spiritual growth looks like in the pages of the Bible. We know that it takes time, just like it takes time for a mustard seed to grow into its full potential and be able to have birds nest in its branches. We know that sometimes it takes being knocked to the ground to understand that we aren't the spiritual giants that we sometimes think we are, as Paul had to learn the hard way on the road to Damascus. We saw in the courage of Ananias that a sign of spiritual maturity is the ability to love our enemies. But one of the things that we haven't really looked at is what is needed both externally and internally to kick off the actual transformation process. So today I want to look at a couple of other passages to help fill in that gap. First up is a series of metaphors from Matthew 9, but they could just as easily be taken from Mark 2 or Luke 5 because the same metaphors are used in all three places in roughly the same context early on in Jesus' ministry. In all three places, Jesus is fielding a question on why his disciples don't fast like the Pharisees or the disciples of John the Baptist. Since fasting is what Jews did to signal mourning or repentance, Jesus' first answer is, nobody fasts at a wedding. Then he seems to shift gears and adds that if you sew a new piece of cloth onto an old garment, then the patch is going to shrink when you wash it and pull it away from the cloth, and your patching is going to be no good. And if you put new wine in old wineskins, you'll burst the skin and lose the wine. If you watch the little video before this in the worship service, you'll understand how that process worked. The point of all three examples is that a new thing requires special care and attention. Sometimes that means setting aside the rules. So maybe you don't fast at the celebration of a new marriage. But it also means you can't just throw the new thing into something well established, or you're going to end up messing up both the new thing and the old thing. What isn't as clear in the wineskins and the old cloth metaphors of Jesus is the point of reference. And biblical scholars fall roughly into two camps on this. The more common one is that Jesus is talking about Judaism versus Christianity, that Judaism is somehow the old brittle skin and the new wine Jesus is offering is Christianity, this new faith that will go with it. That interpretation is an example of what we call supersessionism. Big word, but it means Christianity is better than Judaism. It supersedes it and moves in to take its place. So in that view, Christian faith supersedes Jewish faith. That's yet another example of how anti-Semitism creeps into Christianity and misunderstands what both Jesus and Paul taught in the pages of the Bible. As a reminder, there are no Christians in this story, not as we would define the term. Christianity as a faith apart from Judaism doesn't exist for more than a century after the story of the Bible closes. The interpretation I find most convincing is one articulated by the 16th century reformer John Calvin, which, if you know me, is rare because I am not a fan of John Calvin. But here, he suggests that the new thing for which the rules need to bend and for which new cloth and new wineskin is needed is not Judaism, but rather Jesus' fledgling disciples and the process of spiritual growth that they have just left their jobs to follow Jesus and explore. To find support for that, consider the context. This passage comes at the very outset of Jesus' ministry in all three Gospels. And Jesus has just called Matthew from his tax booth a detail that's the same in Matthew, Mark, and in Luke. In all three places, the question about fasting isn't about whether Jews should fast. Jesus is being asked by the disciples of John the Baptist why they and the Jewish leadership have to fast while Jesus' disciples don't. In other words, we're all Jews. Why are your disciples getting special treatment? Jesus is not advocating for replacing an old faith with a new one. He's saying that his disciples, whom he's just pulled from the ranks of uneducated fishermen and corrupt tax collectors, are so new to any religious practice that the containers for mature faith are unsuitable. The growth of these new folks not only will do harm to the container, the wineskin or the original cloak. Those things are still perfectly suitable for mature wine and cloth, by the way. But it will ruin the newcomers as well. No one wins in those situations. Their time for fasting will come, he reminds them. It just isn't now, because they have yet to grow. On a practical level, that's an issue I've seen for decades as churches in the U.S. have tried to grapple with the changing religious landscape and the fact that many people now come to the church without a background in Christian faith or, for that matter, with any faith at all. When I was on the staff of a 3,000-member church in Florida, I was charged with developing a new worship service for Saturday nights that would be an accessible point of entry for those unfamiliar with the church. There were very few traditional elements in that service, and we had sincere and heated debates about whether communion should be included there, because some believed it would be a stumbling block to those considering Christianity. Our debate about that wasn't about changing Christian faith or whether Christians should or shouldn't celebrate communion. It was about the container for that service and whether what I was creating left enough room and space for the stretching and pulling and questioning that naturally accompany spiritual growth. I've also seen it play out in Bible studies, where those who may not even own a Bible have tried to engage with those raised on its stories since childhood, often resulting in discussions that pull the new cloth apart from the old on the first wash and end up helping nobody. So interpreting the wineskin and the cloth metaphor as a reference to the newly minted disciples instead of to some new and separate faith that isn't going to exist for another 100 years or more makes much more sense to me, especially given its context at the beginning of Jesus' ministry, right as he's called the disciples. If you put that concept back into the seed metaphor, it's like reminding people that if you're starting a plant from seed, you might want to keep it in the house until it has enough of a root system to survive being planted outdoors. We saw a couple of weeks ago that even Paul, who had risen through the religious ranks to become an expert in Jewish law, still had to go back to Tarsus for 12 years after his experience before he would be ready to be sent on his first missionary journey. But even with all of that, there's still a piece missing. The new wineskin is only needed for new wine, not water. What is it that changes the water into wine? Even if it's new wine, even if it's just starting that process, how does it get there? What makes a seed fertile enough to start growing roots in the first place? What is it that needs to happen inside of a person to jumpstart spiritual growth? That's where I think John's gospel comes in. The particular illustration about wineskins and cloth doesn't occur in John like it does in the other gospels. But there are some interesting parallels at roughly the same point in Jesus' ministry. In the first chapter of John, Jesus calls his first disciples. Next up in John 2, we get the wedding at Cana, where we talked about last month, the changing the water into wine, giving the message that his ministry is about transformation. Then in chapter 3, where you might expect the wineskins and the cloth story from the other Gospels. Instead, we have the story of Nicodemus. And Jesus tells Nicodemus that what is needed is a new womb for a new birth. Nicodemus, like Paul, is a Pharisee. But unlike Paul, Nicodemus is part of the Sanhedrin, the religious body in Israel that held political power in religious matters. It would be the Sanhedrin which was always led by the high priest, who would later put Jesus on trial, and who would authorize Paul to go to Damascus to arrest Jesus' followers. Nicodemus has been raised in the faith, and he has risen into the highest ranks as a religious leader. The context lets us know that he's a bit nervous about being seen with Jesus, because Nicodemus comes at night. But we should also remember that this is the Gospel of John, where everything is written on multiple levels. One of the key metaphors throughout John is the contrast between light and dark. The fact that Nicodemus comes at night is telling us that he felt he needed to speak to Jesus in secret, yes, but it's also John saying that Nicodemus is metaphorically in the dark. Unlike some of Jesus' other encounters with Pharisees, this one is amicable. Nicodemus addresses Jesus with respect by calling him rabbi, and what he presents isn't a question or a challenge. He's not throwing down a gauntlet. He's not accusing Jesus of something. He simply says, "We know that you're a teacher who has come from God, for no one can do these signs that you do apart from the presence of God." Presumably that "we" in "we know" means at least some of the other Pharisees and leaders are on board with that. Well, okay, so that's nice, but why are you here, Nicodemus? He doesn't say. And none of the other Gospels has this story or even mention Nicodemus at all to give us any more clues. All we have is John telling us that Nicodemus is literally and figuratively in the dark. And the metaphor for that becomes clear shortly. Jesus famously responds, "Very truly I tell you, no one can see the kingdom of God without being born from above," or born again. It can be translated either way. That metaphor throws Nicodemus for a loop. The Pharisees were legal experts, so it's easy for him to slip into a literal interpretation of Jesus' words, which he does, making him sound pretty silly, actually. How can anyone be born again after having grown old? Can one enter a second time into the mother's womb and be born? Come on, Nicodemus, you're sounding like a member of Congress. Jesus sets him straight. Spiritual birth, Nicodemus. We're talking spirit. In a physical birth, you're born with water as your mother's water breaks. You need that. You kind of need to be physically born to have this conversation. But if you want to really see what's going on, you need an equivalent spiritual birth. What is born of the flesh is flesh, and what is born of the spirit is spirit. Nicodemus is still baffled. How can these things be? At which point Jesus sees that he's got his work cut out for him. Are you a teacher of Israel, and yet you do not understand these things? Jesus clearly expected more than he was getting from the upper echelons of religious leadership. If Nicodemus wants to grow, he needs to put aside all the complexities of faith that he has learned and studied, the comfortable old cloth that he's been interpreting for others, and crawl into a new, limited, yet expandable space. There he will need to forget what he thinks he knows and become a spiritual embryo that can develop the capacity for spiritual sight, movement, and understanding. Over time, he will grow and reach the point where he can be born again. And with that new spiritual capacity, he will gradually become wine. The new wineskin will expand, the new swaddling clothes will be washed again and again, and he will be able to truly understand all that he learned before. We see in Paul that all of his training and study as a Pharisee and all of the disciplined practice of his years of faith didn't need to be trashed. He just had to put all of those things aside for a while as he underwent a new birth in spiritual understanding. Once he had that new birth, which remember took over a decade, all his training and study came back in a rush, and with new eyes to see it, God could use him to change the world. For all the hoorah surrounding being born again in our culture, Jesus is not saying anything different to Nicodemus in John 3 than he said to his disciples back in Matthew 18, verses 3 and 4, when they were arguing about who was the greatest in God's kingdom. Jesus told them, "Unless you change and become like children, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. Whoever becomes humble like this child is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven." Being born again is not about saying some magic words. And if we're fortunate enough to have someone paying as much attention to our spiritual development as to our physical development as children, we typically won't have a dramatic knocked off your horse moment later. It still takes time to mature, but we'll only need one wineskin and one piece of cloth because physical and spiritual maturity would all be happening at once. However old we are, whatever our station in life, we have to grow spiritually just as we did physically. And they both take time. You screw up in both ways. You have growing pains and all the rest of it. But we have to begin spiritually as well as physically at birth. And if it didn't happen at our actual birth, we got to have a new one so that we can start. If our spiritual growth didn't track with our physical growth, if the learning of our minds outpaced the learning of our hearts, if we learn to judge but never to love, we will need a new birth, a spiritual birth. We don't yet belong with the nicely aged wine, or like Paul before his conversion, we can do more harm than good. We must find the humility to accept a new childhood of faith, to step back and learn from gentle souls like Ananias, or humble fishermen like Peter, even if we are wealthy and educated and a recognized leader in our field. We can just drop our nets and go, like Peter, James, and John did. We can grow into it naturally, like many of the prophets, and as it seems Ananias might have done. Or we can be hard-headed and self-important and wait to be knocked to the ground like Paul to understand. But if we never do that, if we're never born again, we're going to spend our lives in the dark. Amen.
In gratitude for God's abundant love, evidenced most clearly in the broken body and shed blood of Jesus, we return to God a portion of what has been given to us for God's work in our shared ministry. Friends and members are asked to prayerfully consider giving in support of Crawford's ministries and operations. You can give electronically by clicking the button in the weekly messenger or on our website, or you can mail a check to 34 Dick Street, Winchester, Mass. 01890.